Hey everyone, Warwick's here. One of the most important aspects of World of Warcraft, and one of the ones that interests me the most, is class design. What I wanted to do today was touch on my favorite classes to play mechanically this expansion. I've tried all the classes at least on a class trial basis, and wanted to give my thoughts on more each individual spec. Consider this a more podcast format video, with this plus 7 King's Rests on my Death Knight, for those that wanted to watch something at the same time. We're going to start with tanks, and then we'll do healers in this video. The next couple of videos we'll do range DPS and melee DPS. So think of this as a sort of mini 3-part series, I guess, on the specs of World of Warcraft. This is going to be a little bit less formal, probably a little less more scripted than the retrospective videos, so something to keep in mind there. Also laugh at me real quick as I get hit for over 1,000,000 damage here in just a little bit by this Guardian on the very first pull of King's Rest. My group is known for crap first pulls and making it work from there. Alright, so for this video, this is not going to be a ranking of power. This is going to be focused on how I felt the specs played based on my personal taste and my personal experiences. Consider this a fun think piece and something we can have fun discussing in the comments below. For those that don't want to listen to the rest of the way, the short ranking for tanks is this from 6 to 1. At number 6, Prot Warrior, 5, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Brewmaster Monk, Prot Paladin, Guardian Druid, and Blood DK at the top. For healers, it's Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, Restoration Druid, Restoration Shaman, Mistweaver Monk, and Holy Priest. Let's go ahead and dive right into the tank specs, and we'll talk about why I liked and disliked about each spec. We'll start at the bottom with Prot Warrior. Undeniably strong in Mythic Plus, and maybe not as much in Raid, Prot Warrior's gameplay style of Thunderclap spam never really clicked with me. Ignore Pain off the GCD did wonders for the spec after their changes in 8.1, but its mitigation tools never really felt like they felt fun to me. Shield Block, Ignore Pain, they just don't seem all that great, even though the Guardian Druid tools are kind of the same. Even though it really shouldn't impact these tank rankings, the other specs of each tank class definitely play a part in my desire and my willingness to play a specific tank. For Warrior, Fury and Arms are probably two of my top 5 melee specs. We'll find out once we get into the melee video. As a result, these two DPS specs being really fun and really engaging to me made Prot Warrior a little bit of a difficult ask for me to play. When I logged my Warrior, it was never really I didn't really log it wanting to play Prot. I wanted to play DPS because Fury and Arms have so much going for them that I find really fun and interesting in this expansion. The block playstyle of tanking doesn't really appeal to me that much. It doesn't feel flavorful. It's very traditional, something that Prot Warrior has always kind of been discussed as being. It's just a very traditional tank. It's power fantasy. It's very vanilla traditional fantasy in that you are the stalwart defender of your allies with your sword and shield in hand. Again, Prot Warrior did fantastic work in N+ this season. It was the mandatory tank for I think almost the entirety of 3 seasons of Battle for Azeroth Mythic Plus. But if you asked me to play one, I would probably push back a little bit. I wouldn't be too thrilled if I was forced into it. It's just not a spec that I have as my first choice, clearly. And if you ask me to play Warrior at all, I'm looking more at Fury or at Arms. Let's move on to Vengeance Demon Hunter. The fast gameplay style of Vengeance was a bonus for the spec, but Vengeance kind of gets caught in a case of lost identity. If you spec offensively with Spirit Bomb and Fracture, you were too squishy in a lot of scenarios to be effective as a tank. But if you spec the more defensive build with Gluttony and Feed the Demon, you were pretty weak as a damage dealer and you possibly had threat issues. Vengeance doesn't really know what it wants to accomplish as a result. That said, the sigils utility are visually awesome and a great way to have utility in a unique manner. But in Raid, the ability to use them was limited, and Flame Sigil, which was very key to the Demon Hunter rotation, just didn't do a ton of damage. It felt just kind of there. I didn't find either these offensive or defensive playstyles to be all that fun, The build that I did like, revolving around Fell Devastation, was really bad this expansion. Vengeance may move up next expansion, as Fell Devastation is getting a lot of support through the talents and just baseline changes to the ability. This expansion though, I just struggled to want to play it, because I never felt like I was tanky enough I needed to be, without sacrificing the fun gameplay of the offensive build. Vengeance doesn't suffer from the same thing as Prot does, as I didn't really find Havoc to be that engaging either. You'll find that I find it kind of middling at best when we get to the melee video. So it did not have like another spec was just so good that it made this spec made Vengeance not feel like it was the first priority for me. Gameplay styles, neither of them really clicked with me. We'll see what happens with Shadowlands though. Moving on to Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster is barely number 4 here. It was almost number 3. Monk is actually going to be most likely one of my 4 classes that I play next expansion. And the changes to the spec of Brewmaster for Shadowlands have me pretty excited for it. But focusing on BfA, this expansion, it struggled to feel really good at lower levels, which is kind of important when you level them from 1 to 120. Big part of learning to tank comes from tanking these lower level dungeons and learning to use the tools that you have and then just adding them on over time. Brewmaster, until you got to level 78, and even then it really took until around level 90, it just felt like it was really squishy. The stagger mechanic didn't really feel like it did a lot, and mastery is just so important for Brewmaster that until you got it, it just felt like you were always just sponging up the heals from your healer. Once you did get enough mastery though, it definitely felt like it could be unkillable at times, which is good when you're leveling, and probably not good overall when you're at the end game, when it becomes basically the mandatory tank of choice, because you just never ever feel like you die unless your raid is wiping. From a playstyle perspective, the constant spamming of Fortifying Brew just wasn't fun. Hitting a button every 8 seconds just because you have to just doesn't feel like it brings about interesting gameplay to me. However, Fortifying Brew is gone next expansion, and Celestial Brew takes its place. Purifying Brew is still around, and it interacts interestingly with Celestial Brew. As a result, I think this makes both brews a little bit more thought out. You have to kind of make some very quick minutia style decisions. That's something that I really enjoy about any spec I play in Battle for Azeroth. And with Celestial Brew feeling like something that you're going to have to think about how you're going to maximize its usage of, it makes the spec feel a lot more attractive to me. Even though a lot of other people I know have said that the spec feels kind of boring to play because you're just getting Fortifying Brew in the guard passive, and so it makes it really difficult to want to, or rather to feel like it has any flavor. I haven't played beta, so I don't know for certain, but just from an outsider looking in, someone that doesn't have a ton of experience on Brewmaster Monk, this definitely looks like a spec that I'm going to be really looking forward to trying out, should I actually get into beta. And if not, I'll be just leveling it through the new leveling system once I get probably at least 2 of my characters to max level. As I don't know if I want to play Hunter or Brewmaster / Mistweaver as my 3rd most played class. That being said, I think Brewmaster is going to have a lot of interesting things going for it. I think it'll be a lot of fun to play in Shadowlands, so really excited about trying it out. At number 3, Prot Pally. A spec that probably would have been number 1 or 2 patches ago. Paladin definitely fell off for me pretty hard as we got into 8.3. The playstyle in theory is good, with great AoE tanking tools, a kit that does solid damage with Avenger's Shield, Judgment, Blessed Hammer, Hammer of the Righteous, depending on what you play. However, mitigation uptime not being 100% for me quickly became a problem the higher amount of the content that I did. As a result, even at low Mythic Plus keys like a +5, I just felt really squishy compared to my Druid or my DK. Overall, I had a lot of fun with the spec early, and I think that's why it carries this number 3 spot for me, is because I did play a lot of it in 8.1 and 8.2 in particular. Otherwise, I think it probably would have fell below number 4. The mitigation uptime issue was just super big for me. When I feel like I misplay even slightly, I just get really heavily punished. Prot Warrior tends to do this too. For me, as someone that is barely above average, guild name, haha, yeah. Anyways, even though I'm kind of like an average to an above average tank, so having something that punishes you that hard is not necessarily the most fun for me. But we'll move on now. We're going to drop in on Guardian Druid at number 2. A spec that had trouble with its community perception all expansion, I found Guardian to be surprisingly fun. This will probably be a little bit controversial or a surprise, since most of the community memes on Bear Druids pretty hard. That said, it's an easy spec to learn and an easy one to master, and it came at the right time for me. Bear Druid was the first tank that I had ever played at a consistent level in World of Warcraft. When I played from 2005 to 2010, I was a DPSer. I played Balanced Druid, Rogue, Survival Hunter, and occasionally dipped into healing with Restoration Shaman, Banana Bean spam, but never really focused on being a tank exclusively. And Bear Druid was the first one, actually, that I did this on. It made me feel like I was effective pretty quickly and pretty early, because it is easy to learn, and so as a result, the actual tools to stay alive are pretty easy to capture, and it allows you to then focus on some of the other aspects of being a tank. Mob control, picking up new adds as they come in, learning a route, learning how to go through the dungeon, how to set a pace for the dungeon that keeps your DPSers engaged while keeping your healer from feeling like they're just being left out to dry mana-wise. That easy playstyle can sometimes put a ceiling on the spec, but overall, I found Guardian to be fun and engaging, and allowed me to focus on those other things so that I could learn to be a much more effective tank. Now, you might say their tools are no different than Prot Warriors. You just rotate, ignore pain and shield block on a Prot Warrior. Here, you're just spamming Iron Fur. But for some reason, spamming Iron Fur and it being off the GCD the whole time, it never really felt like I was kind of slowing myself down. Whereas with shield block, you definitely did that. Yes, Survival Instincts was on the GCD, Frenzied Regen was on the GCD, and that definitely kind of hurt the spec a little bit from a standpoint of having a faster gameplay style. But Barkskin and Iron Fur being off the GCD, to me, made it feel like those were enough tools off the GCD to where if I needed to scream out in a pinch, I could get it done. Instead of executing a complex rotation like Prot Warrior sometimes has in order to deal damage or survive, Guardian Druid just allows you to focus on the thing that tanks need to do most of all, and that's just stay alive. It was the right style of tank at the right time for me learning to tank. There's always an interesting question when people say, hey, I want to tank for the first time, what tank do I learn? Vengeance Demon Hunter comes up a lot, and that's definitely not a bad choice. Some people even suggest Prot Paladin because you just have a ton of tools and a ton of utility that are going to make you useful to a group no matter what. I actually say it's Guardian Druid. Yes, the playstyle may not be the most fanfare in terms of what it does, but it's a spec that you're going to be able to pick up really, really quickly, and then as a result turn around to being able to pick up the other things of tanking very quickly. Guardian Druid is really good for that, despite the fact that it gets memed on pretty badly by everyone else. Enough talk about bears. I could go on for them for ages, just like I could our number one tank for me, and that is the Blood DK. Blood DK's style of tanking took some time for me to adjust to, but once I did get used to the style of the self-healing gameplay, Blood became my main tank spec for BfA, and most likely will continue to be my main tanking spec in Shadowlands. The playstyle really grew on me as I continued to play it, as I leveled through the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. I'd been unholy almost exclusively up to that point, but decided to give this out once I had been playing Druid for a little while and fell in love with Guardian and the style of tanking there. Decided to try my hand at Blood, and it was one of the best decisions that I've made this expansion. The self-healing playstyle definitely gives you a sense of control over your own health bar in some ways, although it took me a little bit to figure out the exact mechanics of Deathstrike. That's maybe just being a noob tank. And there's a lot of cooldowns that Blood can bring to the table, whether baseline through Icebound Fortitude, Vampiric Blood, Empowered Dancing Rune Weapon. And then you could also spec more if you really wanted them, and things like Tombstone and Blood Tap and things of that nature. That heavy cooldown based playstyle made me feel like I had a tool for everything. I don't run anything beyond the normal kits. You see on my weak ores here, just next to Icebound is Bone Storm. That's the only additional ability that I've talented. I run a more passive playstyle tree. It's kind of what Blood is excelled at this entire expansion. But even those 4 tools that I have felt like I could, of course, anti-magic shell as well. So those 5 tools actually made me feel like that the tools that I had at my disposal worked for almost any situation if I used them right. And I think that was kind of unique, whereas most of the tanks, the tools didn't always necessarily feel right until you figure out how to use them. Death Grip is one of the most fun abilities ever that the game has introduced, and the DK fantasy feels really powerful, and Death Grip only enhances that. Yes, you're slow, but if you can pull shit towards you, isn't that just fun? Interesting? Death Grip is just one of the best things that happen in the game, in my opinion, from a sort of playstyle coolness factor perspective, and PvE content, of course. So I've mentioned the other specs here. Guardian Druid, Feral was okay in theory. Balanced Druid was okay as well. Restoration Druid didn't click with me as much. You'll see why here in a little bit. For some of the other tanks like Brewmaster, Mistweaver definitely is a strong spec, so that definitely probably hurt Brewmaster just slightly. And as I said with the bottom 2, just their DPS specs. In the case of Vengeance, didn't hurt it, but for Prot Warrior, definitely hurt it. For Blood, Unholy, I thought was one of the best DPS specs in the game to play. You'll see it's probably number 1 on the rankings as I'm kind of thinking about it right now. Frost is definitely really good and one that I enjoyed. But with the fact that Frost wasn't just like number 1, number 2 with Unholy, made Blood a little bit more appealing for me to play. The other thing that really makes Blood appeal to me as well is the fact that it's a 2-handed tank. I love the idea of a guy that is unkillable and still finds a way to use a 2-handed weapon. It's why like Barbarians and Dungeons and Dragons are kind of a class that always interests me when I want to play a heavy tank-based character, because you're just a hit point sponge. And Blood DK is kind of that way. Your effective health is through the roof, just like Brewmaster. So yeah, there's just a lot that goes through DK. There was just so much that clicked with me this expansion for this spec, and that's why it's easy number 1 and a spec that I fully intend on moving forward with in Shadowlands, and I don't think I'll have any regrets about it. Anyways, that's how I feel about tanks. Again, the ranking is 1 Death Knight, 2 Druid, 3 Paladin, 4 Monk, 5 Demon Hunter, and 6 Warrior. If we did a power ranking of how the specs performed, this list is probably extremely different. For Raid, just thinking about it off the top of my head, I'd give it at number 1 Monk, a giant gap, with DK, Paladin, Demon Hunter, Warrior, and Druid most likely in that order following that. For Mythic Plus, it'd be Warrior, giant gap, Vengeance, Demon Hunter, Monk, Paladin, Druid, and DK, even though DKs were very strong early on. Anyways, guys, that's my feelings on the tank. We're going to go ahead and move on to the healers now, so we'll jump right in with them, and again, we'll start at number 6 with the Holy Paladin. Actually, before we jump into Holy Paladin, let me first start by saying my preferred healing playstyle is a lot more old school or traditional. When I say that, I mean that staying back with the ranged DPS and using every point of mana for healing was the original style of healing I played back in Burning Crusade. Since coming back to Warcraft with Battle for Azeroth, I haven't delved as deep with healers and the more damage to heal oriented playstyles. This definitely plays a part in the rankings for healers. Since I have the least experience with healers, this section will be potentially shorter than the tanks. I just don't feel as qualified to elaborate on healers like I do with tanks. So let's now go with the Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin has a great power fantasy of the melee healer. Beacon of Light and the mastery that supports it gives Holy Paladin a well-defined general playstyle of being right in the mix with your tank and your melee DPS. It's got a great mix of tools and the usual Paladin utility. So why is it at the bottom? A lot of it has to do with the Paladin class as a whole feeling less fun and engaging as the expansion went on, and the other part has to do with Glimmer of Light. I'm not a huge fan of the Glimmer playstyle, even though it is undeniably powerful and something that the spec needed this expansion to stay relevant. I preferred the 8.0 playstyle of healing, which was before Glimmer. Sadly, that playstyle just didn't have enough throughput, healing-wise, to be competitive. Holy Paladin is right behind Disc Priest for the dealing damage to heal playstyles, and as I said earlier, I'm not very comfortable with that style of play. Overall, Holy Paladin suffers more from the fact that Paladins as a whole just felt less fun to me as the expansion wore on. It definitely has some interesting tools coming in Shadowlands, and I'm looking forward to seeing what high-level players do with it. Let's move on to Disc Priest. With this, when you think about doing damage to heal, everyone thinks of Disc Priest. Disc is widely praised as the most fun healing spec in Warcraft. Some even call it the most fun healing spec in any MMO active on the market right now. There's a lot to love about Disc. The playstyle is very challenging, but highly rewarding as a result. You bring very valuable tools and damage reductions through things like Power Word Barrier, and damage mitigation through shields like Power Word Shield. And you avoid the dreaded lockout of a certain spell school if you're interrupted, since you have both Shadow and Holy healing spells. Personally, I found Disc frustrating to learn. The difference between a great Disc Priest and a terrible one was a monstrous sized gap. This actually isn't a bad thing. I want more of that in Warcraft if we're being really honest here. The pressure on a healer in a 5-man dungeon is almost as equally high as the pressure on the tank. That pressure made learning the spec under fire difficult for me. There's also another elephant in the room: Holy Priest. Like Prot Warrior, Disc Priest suffers from the fact that there's another healing spec that I found to be incredibly fun and engaging. Disc Priest is a fantastically designed spec. Its style just isn't for me. I'm comfortable with this, and I think that's okay for the game as a whole. We're going to move on to Resto Druid. The master of healing over time effects, Resto Druid, like the previous two specs, is undeniably powerful in the content that it excels at. In this case, it's Mythic Plus and PvP, before this season. The biggest thing against Resto Druids for me was that I found it to be boring. I found the style of rolling hops and then just bombing regrowth to be kind of dull. Maybe there's some user error in playstyle, but from my limited experience and limited knowledge, this just really was difficult for me to grasp. On the flip side, it did open windows of time to allow for damage to be done. This is what pushes Druid above the other two specs we've already discussed. You make a choice to DPS at the expense of your healing when your hots run out. This made choosing to deal damage a very knowledge-based decision. You had to know your encounters and when it was and was not the right time to deal damage. I really like this type of decision making for healers. I think it's something that I would love to see more of going into Shadowlands, and maybe less of the passive damage style that Holy Paladin and Disc Priest brings to the table. We're going to move on to number 3, the Resto Shaman. The healer that excels at utility and stacked group healing. I played a lot of Resto Shaman when you were spamming a downrank chain heal, never ran out of mana, and topped healing meters back in Burning Crusade. While the style has definitely changed, I found the identity of Resto Shaman to be really fun and engaging. Mixing Healing Surge, Riptide, Healing Rain, Chain Heal, and their mastery itself is all just fun to figure out how to weave and maximize your healing spells to make the most out of them for every point of mana that you spend on them. Balancing the massive utility with a pure throughput challenge was quite fun to figure out. With Windrush Totem, Cloudburst Totem, Elementals, a 6-second or a 15-second kick like Melee have, you just had a lot of utility that was really fun to figure out how to maximize the use of, while still trying to put out the maximum amount of healing. The reason it's not higher on this list is that I always hated that it didn't have a tank external to use on your tank. For every other healer, you could slam Pain Suppression, Iron Bark, Life Cocoon, among some other abilities, to save your tank and catch yourself up. Resto Shaman couldn't do this. You always had to be ahead of what was going to happen and really be proactive in your healing. The sacrifice of healing to deal damage also bumps this up for me for the same reasons that it did for Resto Druid. Overall, Resto Shaman is definitely a spec that I think is quite underrated, in that it loses a lot into the shadows of Disc and Holy because of the passive damage. The passive damage playstyles were just very big this expansion, and that pushed out almost everything else. I think in Hope and Shadowlands that Restoration Shaman, if they can get that tank external, are going to be a top flight healer, and something that I want to see continue being used in Shadowlands by almost every raid team. Moving on to number 2, the Mistweaver Monk. The latest healer to be added to Warcraft, even though it's been 7 years since Monk was introduced with Mist of Pandaria. Mistweaver has been climbing the rankings steadily the more that I played it in this expansion. I love that every ability interacts with each other in some way. which allows for spread healing or single target healing in a lot of very cool and unique ways. The fact that it has two distinct and viable playstyles makes the spec rise the ranking as well. I personally prefer the more upwelling build where you're a more traditional stand back in the back of the group and cast heals, but the fist weaving build definitely has been a star late in this expansion, and it'll be something I want to try out as I play Mistweaver into Shadowlands. The biggest reason it's not number one is that its mastery doesn't really feel important for either style of play, like it does for say Shaman or Holy Priest. This spec could easily take over at number one for Shadowlands though, given some of the changes that I've seen early on, and the fact that I'll have a lot more experience with it as we play Shadowlands, as my monk will most likely be a Mistweaver main and then a Brewmaster off spec. I'm really looking forward to playing monk in Shadowlands, if you can't tell. This class as a whole has just been one that's just really grabbed my attention in the alpha and beta stages of this expansion testing. But enough about monks, let's move on to Holy Priest. At number one, like Guardian Druid, I recommend anyone that wants to get into healing for the first time to play Holy Priest. Guardian, I think, is the easiest tank to learn and master for tanks. Holy Priest, I think, is the easiest to master for healers. It has a very traditional power fantasy. It's the champion of the light, holy paladin, holy cleric style from, say, D&D. The gameplay, though, is anything but traditional. A smart use of your holy words, like Holy Word Salvation, are then complemented by the fact that you can reduce the cooldown on those by using your more basic abilities, such as Flash of Light, and Holy, and Heal. Also, laugh at me for falling off this platform. I didn't actually know you could do this. Back to Holy Priest. Holy Priest has a tool for everything, and it can react to it all. It's a very reactive healer, which I find very fun. While the mobility isn't great, that's not a concern for me. I play DK this expansion, so being slow doesn't bother me. The only reason I won't be playing Holy for Shadowlands is that Disc and Shadow Priest are hard for me to feel engaged with. And as I said earlier, I like to play two specs at a high level when I pick a class to play. Holy Priest is fantastic though, even if it needs more tools for a 5-man content. Anyways, there's my thoughts on healers. Like I said, much shorter section. I just don't feel as qualified to go into them in a more elaborate way. Definitely talk to some healer mains and they'd be able to give you a lot more information on this. That said, overall, I really enjoyed this exercise. It was fun to write, fun to talk about. And I hope you join me in the comments to discuss your favorite tanks and healers to play. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you want more half-scuffed dungeon runs like this one, just join me on Twitch every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday nights from 9:30 p.m. to midnight Central Standard Time in the US. Until then, everyone, stay safe, wear your mask, I'll let music play out the rest of this dungeon, and I will see you next time.